How did Solomon's wisdom spread to far-off lands? And who came to test this wisdom? The Queen of Sheba, one of history's most mysterious figures, set out to meet Solomon. What did she discover during their legendary encounter? In this episode, we explore the fascinating meeting between these two great leaders and the timeless lessons it offers.
How far does wisdom travel? From the courts of Jerusalem to the distant sands of Sheba, my name, Solomon, was carried by merchants, travelers, and whispers of a wisdom unlike any other. But words alone do not satisfy the curious. From the heart of Sheba came its queen, a woman of wealth, power, and questions as sharp as the desert wind. She came not to flatter, but to uncover the truth for herself. The Queen of Sheba, her name lost to history but her legend carved in stone, set out on a journey few would dare to make. Through blistering sun and endless dunes, her caravan stretched across the horizon. Camels laden with gold, spices, and precious stones that sparkled like drops of captured sunlight. But these were not gifts of tribute, they were tokens of a challenge. Her heart was not one easily swayed. She had heard of my wisdom, yes, but words she knew could be false. Kings can claim wisdom, wealth can be mistaken for a blessing. She would see for herself whether Solomon, king of Israel, was truly as wise as they said, or whether the world had woven myths from truth and gold. When she arrived at my court, I saw it in her eyes, the sharpness of a ruler who understood the weight of power. She was not here to bow, she was here to inquire. The questions poured like a torrent, not to tear me down, but to measure the depth of the wisdom I carried. And so began one of the most remarkable encounters in history. Two leaders, two minds, standing face to face, one seeking truth, the other revealing it. What did the Queen of Sheba discover in the halls of Jerusalem? Perhaps more than she ever expected. Wisdom, like a river, does not remain in one place. It flows, carried by mouths and minds to far-off lands. My name had traveled far beyond the borders of Israel, sung in the camps of traders, told in markets under the hot sun, and whispered in the tents of nomads who wandered deserts as old as time. They said I, Solomon, had been blessed by God himself with great wisdom that could unravel mysteries, settle disputes, and even bring peace to restless hearts. My name was carried on the tongues of travelers, traders who brought silks, spices, and gold through dusty cities, their words blending fact and wonder, until my wisdom became the stuff of legend. But words, as sweet as they can sound, are often empty to those who seek truth. Far to the south, where the heat rises like waves from the sands, the Queen of Sheba sat on her throne of ivory and gold. She ruled a land of riches, where incense smoked in temples and spices grew from the earth like treasures hidden by the gods. Her people worshipped her judgment and sang of her beauty, but her mind was sharper than her crown was heavy. She heard the stories of my wisdom from the merchants who stopped at her court. A king, they said, whose words are like light, whose judgments pierce the darkness. She listened, her eyes narrowing, her thoughts a tangle of curiosity and suspicion. The world loves stories, she knew, and kings are often made of myth as much as flesh. But something about these tales stirred her. Perhaps the mention of God, my God, who had blessed me with vast wisdom that seemed to spill over borders. Maybe the merchants insisted that my judgments brought justice, not cruelty. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that no ruler, no matter how mighty, can resist testing the wisdom of another. "Let me see," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "If the tales are true, I will know." Her decision was not impulsive. The Queen of Sheba was not one to be deceived by tales spun of gold and glory. She spent weeks, perhaps months, planning her journey. She would not come quietly, nor would she come empty-handed. If she was to meet the wisest king of all, she would arrive not only as a ruler, but as a challenger. And so, her preparations began. Her journey to Jerusalem was no small feat. She crossed vast deserts that stretched beyond sight, where the sun turned the sands into waves of molten gold, and the wind carved stories into the dunes. Her caravan was no ordinary company of travelers. It was a procession fit for a queen. Hundreds of camels swayed under the weight of their burdens. Gifts of gold, ivory, spices and myrrh, so abundant that the air was heavy with its fragrance. And her servants rode alongside, their armor glinting in the light, as if even the sun dared not outshine them. To those who saw it, the queen's caravan seemed endless, a shimmering line of wealth and purpose that snaked across the horizon. The people along the route stared as she passed, whispering her name in awe. The Queen of Sheba. She was known as a woman of immense power and impossible beauty, but her strength lay not in her jewels or her armies. It lay in her mind, sharp and unyielding, a mind that turned questions into weapons. And she carried those questions with her now, packed away among her treasures. She traveled through nights of bitter cold and days of unrelenting sun. Her people moved as one, their footsteps kicking up dust that swirled like smoke behind them. The desert, vast and silent, seemed to watch her as she passed, testing her endurance. And still she pressed on. For the Queen of Sheba, this was not a pilgrimage of awe, it was a journey of challenge. She had heard the tales of Solomon's wisdom and his God, how his judgments brought peace, how his words were as steady as stone. But hearing is not seeing, and she would see. She would stand in his court, face him as an equal, and ask the questions that no one else dared to ask. For if he truly was as wise as they claimed, he would prove it. If not, the world would know that the King of Israel was a man like any other, cloaked in stories spun too thin. And so the queen rode forward, unshaken, unbowed. As her caravan drew closer to Jerusalem, the cities on her path emptied, their people running ahead to catch the first glimpse of her arrival. I can imagine what they saw, the shimmer of gold beneath the sun, the long line of camels moving like shadows, and the woman at their head. A queen who carried both gifts and questions, her eyes already set on my throne. The journey of weeks or perhaps months left dust in her wake, but not on her resolve. The Queen of Sheba came to Jerusalem not as a worshipper, but as a seeker of truth, and she would not leave without it. The day the Queen of Sheba arrived, Jerusalem hummed with anticipation. Word had traveled faster than her caravan, and for days the city had been preparing for her entrance. Crowds gathered along the streets, their faces flushed with excitement, their voices rising like waves against the palace walls. Merchants abandoned their stalls, children climbed atop shoulders, and even the elders, who had seen kings and warriors come and go, leaned on their staffs to catch a glimpse of the woman who had crossed deserts to test the King of Israel. I stood in the great hall of my palace, the place where my father had once dreamed of building a house for the Lord. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows of stone, filling the space with a warm glow that softened the sharp edges of the gold inlay and polished cedar columns. The air was fragrant with incense and myrrh, perhaps sent from Sheba itself, and the faint aroma mixed with the sweetness of lilies placed in basins of cool water. Outside, the distant sound of trumpets announced her approach, their notes long and lingering, like an invitation to something that had been written long ago. And then she entered. The doors to the great hall opened, and the Queen of Sheba stepped forward. She was no mere traveler, no ruler seeking favor or gifts. She moved as though the world bent itself around her, her steps measured and deliberate, as if to say, "This is my ground as much as yours." She was dressed in robes of indigo and deep gold, fabrics so fine they shimmered with every movement, flowing around her like the waters of a hidden river. Her jewelry caught the light and sent it scattering across the hall. Rubies set like drops of blood against her wrists, pearls strung into crowns woven into her hair. But it was not the silk or the jewels that commanded the room. It was her gaze, dark and unflinching. She swept her eyes across the hall, as if cataloguing every detail: the carved lions that flanked the great throne, the guards standing at attention with spears tipped in silver, and the advisors seated stiffly on either side of me. And then, at last, she looked at me. Her stare did not waver, and for a moment the air seemed to be still. I rose from my throne, the hem of my robe brushing against the marble floor. "Welcome, Queen of Sheba," I said, letting my voice carry the warmth of a host but the steadiness of a king. "You have traveled far, and your arrival honors us." She inclined her head slightly, a gesture so subtle that it could hardly be called a bow. "King Solomon," she replied, her voice like polished stone, smooth but with a weight that hinted at its strength. "I have heard of your wisdom, your riches, and your God. I have crossed mountains and deserts to see for myself whether these tales are true." Her words were simple, but the challenge was clear. She had not come to admire, she had come to measure me, to hold my wisdom in her hands and weigh it like a merchant might weigh gold. Around the room, my advisors sat still, their faces caught somewhere between curiosity and unease. They knew, as I did, that the Queen of Sheba was no ordinary visitor. She was a ruler who tested those who claimed greatness, and many before me had faltered. Would I gestured to the seat prepared for her, an ornate chair set beside my throne, its wood carved and cushioned in deep purple. She did not hesitate. She moved through the hall, and though there were hundreds of eyes upon her, she did not falter, did not shrink. The Queen of Sheba was not here to be awed by kings. She was here to see a man and to judge the truth for herself. When she was seated, the faintest flicker of a smile crossed her lips, barely there, gone as quickly as it came. She was ready. I could see it in her posture, in the stillness of her hands as they rested in her lap. She had come with questions, and she would not leave until they were answered. I returned to my seat, my eyes meeting hers once more. I knew what she saw. Not a boy king, not the son of David, but a ruler, seated with the confidence of one who carried both wealth and wisdom. "You have come a long way," I said, my voice calm but steady, "and I hope you find the answers you seek." She tilted her head, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Truth does not hide from questions, does it, King Solomon?" The hall fell into silence, the weight of her words pressing against the walls. Around us, the faint rustle of servants moving along the edges of the room seemed distant, as though we sat alone in that vast golden space. "No," I replied, "it does not." The faint flicker of a challenge lingered in her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, one hand tracing the gold inlay along the armrest. The questions, I knew, were coming. Questions not of idle curiosity, but of depth, of complexity. Questions designed to test the wisdom I had been given, to see whether the man sitting before her was worthy of the tales she had heard. And so the real meeting began, not with gifts or pleasantries, but with the quiet understanding that this was no ordinary encounter. Two rulers sat across from one another, two minds ready to cross paths, like rivers meeting at the edge of the world. Outside, the city still buzzed with excitement. The crowd still craned their necks to glimpse her procession. But here, in the stillness of the great hall, all of it faded. There was only her voice, my answers, and the truth she sought to uncover. Her questions came like a river, slow at first, winding and clear, but then deeper, stronger, unrelenting. The Queen of Sheba did not waste time on pleasantries. She had crossed vast deserts to sit before me, not to flatter or to be flattered, but to test. She measured my wisdom as a merchant weighs gold, precise and without pity. Her first question was simple, but there was sharpness hidden beneath the silk of her words. "Tell me, Solomon," she began, her voice calm, "what is the foundation of justice? How does a ruler know he has acted rightly?" The room fell still, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, as though even the walls were leaning in to hear. I took a breath, meeting her gaze steadily. "Justice," I said, "is rooted not in law, but in truth. To rule rightly, one must see with clear eyes, through the lies of men, through the noise of their desires, and into their hearts. Justice is not measured by the outcome alone, but by the intent to serve what is true. She listened as though she were tasting my words, letting them rest on her mind to see if they were sweet or bitter. Her fingers traced the edge of the armrest, the faintest smile appearing, one that spoke neither of satisfaction nor doubt, but of acknowledgement. Then came her second question, more pointed than the first. "You are called wise, King Solomon, and wealth surrounds you. But tell me, what use is wisdom if a man has all the riches of the earth, but no peace in his soul?" I leaned forward slightly, my hands clasped as I answered. "A man may build walls of gold and call it his kingdom, but if his heart is empty, those walls are a prison. Wisdom is the key that frees a man from that emptiness. It teaches him that wealth is not an end but a tool to bring goodness, to provide for others, and to build something greater than himself." The Queen of Sheba tilted her head, considering my answer. I could see her weighing each word, her sharp mind hunting for flaws or cracks. She was not satisfied by simple truths. She sought truths that had been tested by fire, truths that could endure scrutiny. Her questions continued, flowing one after another, like the relentless tide against a shore. She asked of the nature of power. What makes a king worthy of his throne and of human weakness? How does a wise man resist the temptations of his own heart? "To be a king," I said, "is to serve more than yourself. Power is not a right, it is a responsibility. A king must be willing to bear the burdens of others, to lead not with pride but with humility, for the throne is not his own, it is entrusted to him for a time." And when she spoke of temptation, of the fragile line between wisdom and folly, I answered, "The wise man knows he is weak. He does not trust in his own strength, but in the strength of the Lord. He surrounds himself with counsel, seeks truth in prayer, and does not linger where temptation can take root." Her gaze did not waver as I spoke, but I could see something shifting in her. It was subtle, like the movement of clouds when the wind changes direction. She had come to test me, and she had expected to find cracks, arrogance, vanity, or the empty charm of a man drunk on his own legend. But with each answer, she found not a king eager to prove himself, but a man who knew the source of his wisdom. At one point her questions slowed, and the room seemed to exhale. The court, though silent, was no less alive. My advisors sat still, their faces unreadable, but I could feel their eyes flicking between us, watching the quiet contest unfold. The servants, though trained to disappear into the edges of the room, lingered just slightly longer, their movements softer, quieter. All of them, whether king or servant, were drawn into the rhythm of the exchange. And yet, she was not done. She leaned forward, her voice soft but clear, as though she were peeling back the final layer of her test. "You have answered wisely, King Solomon, but wisdom without action is like a seed that is never planted. Tell me, what is the greatest thing a man can do with the wisdom he has been given?" I paused, for hers was a question not of wit, but of heart. Around us the air felt heavier, thicker, as though the answer mattered not just to her, but to the room itself. "The greatest thing," I said slowly, "is to use wisdom to serve others. A man does not receive wisdom to glorify himself, he receives it to lift the burdens of those around him. Wisdom that serves only the self becomes pride, and pride will ruin even the wisest of men. But wisdom that is shared, that builds peace, heals wounds, and speaks truth, becomes a blessing not just to the man who carries it, but to all who hear it." She was quiet for a long moment after that. Her gaze dropped, just briefly, to her hands, as though she needed a moment to collect herself. When she looked back up, there was no trace of challenge in her eyes, only something softer, deeper, like respect. "The stories were true," she said at last, her voice softer than it had been when she entered the hall. "Your wisdom surpasses even the tales I have heard." Inclined my head, not as a king receiving praise, but as a man acknowledging a truth that was not his own. "Wisdom is a gift," I replied, "and gifts are not to be hoarded, they are meant to be shared." The smile then was real, unguarded, a rare moment when the Queen of Sheba allowed herself to be seen not as a ruler or a challenger, but as a seeker who had found what she came for. The atmosphere of the court. Throughout our exchange, the atmosphere of the Great Hall shifted. At first, the tension had been sharp, like the edge of a blade. The advisors, the servants, and even the light filtering through the windows seemed to hold its breath. But as the Queen of Sheba's questions deepened, and my answers grew steady and sure, the tension softened, replaced by a kind of reverence. The hall, with its golden walls and carved lions, became more than a room. It became a stage where truth was spoken and sought. The faint scent of incense lingered in the air, curling upward like prayers offered in silence. Outside, beyond the heavy stone walls, Jerusalem hummed with life. But within the palace, it was as though time itself had slowed, as though the world had paused to listen. After we exchanged questions and answers, I rose and invited the Queen of Sheba to see the palace. It was a formality, yes, but it was also more than that. Her questions had tested my mind. Now I sensed she wanted to see how wisdom shaped everything I touched. A king's words could be clever, but the mark of true wisdom lies in what it builds, and in how it sustains life and order. The palace stretched before us like a masterpiece painted by careful hands. Vast, yet intimate, grand without arrogance. The queen walked beside me, her steps measured, her gaze sweeping over everything. She was not a woman overwhelmed by grandeur, for she had seen palaces before, but I noticed her eyes linger not just on the riches, but on the harmony. It was not gold alone that impressed her, it was how everything fit, as though the palace had been carved not just from stone, but from purpose. The great cedar beams, polished and oiled, ran high above us like ribs in the belly of a ship, their fragrance mingling with the faintest trace of incense. Sunlight filtered in through latticed windows of carved wood and alabaster, softening as it touched the marble floors that gleamed beneath our feet. Every corner, every chamber seemed alive with detail. Tapestries woven with scenes of our history, brass urns overflowing with lilies and violets, fountains murmuring as if they shared their prayers. The queen stopped at the foot of a massive staircase, her eyes following the lines of the carved railings. Lions intertwined with olive branches, symbols of strength and peace woven together. Her fingers brushed the wood, tracing its craftsmanship. "Even your walls tell stories, King Solomon," she said. "A kingdom without stories," I replied, "is a kingdom without memory. Wisdom teaches that people must remember who they are and where they came from." I led her into the throne room, where my seat of ivory stood on a dais of polished gold. 12 lions, 6 to my left, 6 to my right, flanked the steps, carved so lifelike that one might have expected them to roar. Their presence was not meant to intimidate, but to symbolize the balance of power and justice. The queen paused, her expression unreadable, as though weighing the throne and what it represented. "Your throne is remarkable," she said finally, "but it is the order around it that speaks louder than its gold." Her words carried more weight than mere observation. She had seen kingdoms where power was gilded in excess while chaos festered beneath. Here she saw something different. The servants moved with quiet precision, their robes clean, their faces calm. The advisors stood at attention, their postures straight and their eyes steady. Even the guards, their spears gleaming, watched with the quiet confidence of men who knew their role and the justice of the throne they served. "Order is not created by wealth," I told her. "It is created by wisdom and discipline. A throne means little if its foundation is not justice." From the throne room we moved to the dining halls, where preparations for the evening feast had begun. The queen's gaze lingered on the tables. Long expanses of smooth cedar adorned with vessels of gold and silver, each piece polished to a mirror's sheen. Servants carried platters of fruit, roasted meats, and flagons of wine, with the practiced ease of a symphony's players. Each movement deliberate and harmonious. "Even your servants are blessed by your wisdom," she observed, her voice touched with something close to wonder. "They move as though their work is a privilege, not a burden." I smiled. A man's wisdom is seen not in how he treats his equals, but in how he treats those who serve him. Their work sustains this palace, as wisdom sustains the heart of a kingdom. At last I brought her to the temple, the place where gold did not merely reflect wealth, but worship. The temple was the crown of Jerusalem, its walls carved and inlaid with gold so pure it seemed to glow with its own light. The scent of frankincense hung thick in the air, curling toward the heavens like prayers that could not be silenced. The queen stopped at the entrance, her breath catching just slightly as she looked inside. "Ready for viewing?" Alec asked. She moved forward, her steps slow, reverent, as though she were walking into the heart of something sacred. The carvings on the walls, cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, seemed almost alive under the light of the torches. In the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant rested beneath the outstretched wings of two massive cherubim, whose forms were both fierce and protective. The Queen of Sheba stood still for a long moment, her eyes taking in every detail. Her face, usually guarded, softened into something I could not quite name. Wonder, perhaps, or awe? "This," she whispered, "is no work of men alone." "No," I said quietly. "It is the work of faith, the work of a people who remember the covenant they share with the Lord." She turned to look at me then, her expression unreadable but her voice steady. "What you have built here, Solomon, is not just a palace or a temple. It is a reflection of the God you serve and the wisdom you claim to hold. Few men could hold such power without being consumed by it. Power," I said, meeting her gaze, "is a fire that can warm or destroy. Only wisdom can shape it, and only humility can contain it." Her eyes searched mine, as though testing the truth of my words, and for the first time she gave me a small, genuine smile. "Perhaps the world has not exaggerated your wisdom after all, King Solomon." The echo of wonder. As we stepped back into the open air, the late afternoon sun cast golden rays across Jerusalem's walls. The city stretched out before us, alive with the sounds of life, children's laughter, merchants calling out their wares, the steady beat of hammers shaping stone. The Queen of Sheba stood beside me, silent, as she looked over it all. "Your wisdom," she said at last, her voice soft, "is not just in your answers, but in what you have built. A kingdom at peace, a temple of faith, a people who live with purpose. These things cannot be bought with gold or commanded with force." I inclined my head, for there was nothing to add. She had seen what she had come to see. The Queen of Sheba had arrived with questions, but now, as the shadows stretched long across the palace grounds, I knew she would leave with more than answers. She would leave with an understanding, not just of me, but of the God I served and the kingdom He had allowed me to build. Wisdom is not always loud. Sometimes it is in the silence, in the harmony of things created with purpose, in the reverence of a temple that points toward heaven. And as the Queen of Sheba stood there, surrounded by the golden light of Jerusalem, I knew she understood. The day of the Queen of Sheba's departure dawned quietly, the air thick with the golden stillness of early morning. Jerusalem, so alive with anticipation at her arrival, now seemed to hold its breath, as though reluctant to let her go. Servants moved through the palace with quiet precision, their footsteps softened by the weight of the moment. Outside the walls, her caravan stood ready, a procession of camels laden with gifts, their loads far heavier than when they had arrived. The queen herself stood at the threshold of the palace, her figure outlined by the rising sun. She wore robes the color of deep twilight, edged with gold that caught the light and burned like fire. Her crown was simpler now, less a mark of her station and more a part of her. There was something different in her posture, still regal, still powerful, but softened, as though the weight she carried had shifted. I walked toward her, my steps measured, feeling the quiet gravity of what this moment held. Two rulers, two minds that had tested one another, now stood as equals not in rank but in understanding. I saw in her eyes the trace of questions no longer spoken but answered nonetheless. Your time in Jerusalem has been short, Queen of Sheba, I said, my voice steady. But your presence has left its mark. She turned toward me, her dark eyes reflecting both wisdom and thoughtfulness. And you, King Solomon, have exceeded what I had imagined, she replied. I came to see if the stories of your wisdom were true. I leave knowing that they were not only true, but they fell short of the reality. She paused then, as though choosing her words with care, her voice carrying the weight of what she had witnessed. Your God has truly blessed you, not only with wisdom, but with the heart to wield it. Your people, your palace, your temple, everything here speaks of harmony, of a ruler who understands the burden and privilege of power. I inclined my head, humbled by her words. Wisdom, I said quietly, is not mine to keep. It is a gift entrusted to me, to be used for the good of those I serve. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, as though measuring the truth of my words, and then with a faint smile she gestured to her servants who stepped forward bearing gifts, a final act of respect from a queen who gave nothing without intention. These gifts are my thanks, she said. Gold, spices, and precious stones, treasures of my kingdom, but they are little compared to the understanding I carry back with me. What I have seen here cannot be bought with wealth. I too had prepared gifts for her, a gesture not of trade, but of gratitude. Take these as a reminder of your time here, I said, the finest timber, gold from Ophir, and vessels crafted by our artisans. May they reflect the respect we hold for you and your kingdom. There was a quiet exchange then, not of gifts alone, but of mutual recognition. She had tested me as she had tested others before, but now her questions were answered, her doubts laid to rest, and in their place was something stronger, an understanding forged not through conquest, but through conversation. As her servants began the careful work of loading the treasures onto the camels, the queen stepped closer, her voice low, so that only I could hear. Do not forget, Solomon, that wisdom is not only tested in palaces and with questions. It is tested in the heart, where pride waits to undo the great. Remember what you have built here, and guard it, for even kings are not immune to folly. Her words struck me, not as a rebuke, but as a warning spoken from one ruler to another. I nodded, holding her gaze. Pride is a shadow that follows every man, I said, but the fear of the Lord is the light that keeps it at bay. She smiled faintly then, a smile that spoke of understanding more than agreement, and turned to leave. I watched as she descended the palace steps, her robes trailing behind her like the last edge of night giving way to dawn. The city of Jerusalem watched her departure. Crowds lined the streets again, though now they were silent, awed not by her wealth or beauty, but by the story she had become. A queen who had come to challenge wisdom and had left with respect, her heart filled with answers she had not known she sought. From my place on the palace steps, I watched her caravan move through the city gates, the dust rising in waves as camels swayed under the weight of their treasures. Her silhouette remained sharp against the horizon for a long time, a final memory that lingered even as she disappeared into the sands. When the last echoes of her departure faded, I remained alone on the palace steps, my gaze fixed on the place where she had vanished. I thought of her questions, each one deliberate, each one cutting to the heart of power, faith, and purpose. She had tested my wisdom, yes, but her presence had tested something deeper. My humility, my understanding of the gifts I had been given. Wisdom is a fire, I realized, both light and heat. It can warm a kingdom, guide its people, and build what others thought impossible, but unchecked, it can consume even the wisest man. The Queen of Sheba had seen that. She had tested me not to find flaws, but to see whether my wisdom had turned inward, whether the fire burned only for myself. Her final words echoed in my mind. Wisdom is tested in the heart. And she was right. It is in the quiet moments, when the questions cease and the crowds fall silent, that a man sees who he truly is. I turned back toward the palace, the great doors waiting open like the mouth of a cavern. My throne, my temple, my city. They were all the fruits of wisdom, but they were also a trust. I had been given much, and much would be required of me. As I walked through the halls, the light of morning spilling through the windows, I whispered a quiet prayer. Lord, keep me humble. Let my wisdom serve others, not myself. Let this house, this kingdom, and this throne always reflect your glory, and not my own. And so I carried her words with me, long after she had gone. For wisdom, I understood, is not a crown to wear. It is a burden to bear.
Solomon's wisdom and prosperity made him a symbol of a perfect kingdom. But could he remain faithful to God when faced with temptation? Join us for the final episode as we uncover Solomon's downfall and the lessons we can all learn from his story. Don't forget to like, share this video, and leave your thoughts about the Queen of Sheba in the comments below. Subscribe so you don't miss the final episode of The Wisdom of Solomon.